So I'm going to start with Sue, if that's okay. Yep. Sue, just you've got such a diverse and rich background, and in your experience, what do you think that the changing forces are that are going to influence the composition of skills and the development of those skills that companies and I guess our country needs?
Okay, well, in looking at this, is that better? Yes, that's better. Some major drivers of change that affect the workforce, and they are demographic and social factors, the economic factors, environment and energy sources, and of course technology and globalisation. And you know, technology has been a huge factor recently. We really feel it. The jobs are changing from production. Much more so, we've lost the car industry here in Australia, but we've got a whole lot of other sub-industries emerging. And really, as the Minister said today, technology is a key driver, but it always has been. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, and even though we've seen our economy move from one of production to services, we have always managed to maintain the productivity gains by shifting labour from those less productive areas to be freed up to go into higher productivity jobs. So I would say that we've been there before, the history's there, and we've achieved it, so there is good reason for optimism. The technology has, of course, reduced costs for business to be operating globally, and we've seen a lot of that too. So businesses can diversify their markets and their labour markets in particular. And so the global supply chains, for example, can see all parts of production process operating, from research, design, production, marketing can be happening anywhere in the world, wherever the skills can be obtained for the most competitive price. And clearly that's had implications for our skill needs. The race between skills and changing technology has been one that we've mostly kept up with. So the work that we did in the Australian Workforce and Productivity Agency, we were looking at industry demand to see what the skills needs would be, and back in about 2011, the proportion of the workforce that had qualifications, and I would include in there all post-school qualifications, so that's trade through to higher education, had been around 60%. And across different scenarios, we were forecasting that would need to increase to about 70 to 73% through to 2025. But certainly what you'd see from 10 years previous to 2011 is that the proportion was much less. So that has been happening. It means that players in the labour market are responding. They understand that it's important that they invest in their own education, and government policy has obviously been focused on that as well.
And Ziggy, I'm going to take that a bit further, if I can, to ask you. So the work that you do, obviously through not only the organisations that you're members of the board on or chairman, but with the universities, and we had a conversation over lunch around the need for a bipartisan approach to education, organisations and government working together. Can you give us your insights on that, please?
Sure. Firstly, just to emphasise some of the points that the Minister made around STEM training, so science, technology, engineering and maths. Why is that important? Well, the vocabulary associated with the future, where is the future economic growth going to come from, where are jobs going to come from? You get words like IT, software, nanotechnology, biotechnology. These are disciplines where you can play in them only if you have appropriate STEM training. At the same time, countries, nations with whom we compete are putting more and doing better in this area than we are. For example, 1 in 6 Australian graduates graduate with some degree of STEM discipline in their degree, whereas in Singapore it's half, and in China and India it's somewhere in between, and the US. That partly explains what one of the questions that was asked earlier this afternoon about the gap that we've got in capable IT people. What we've found is that as Australia has needed more IT support and we don't have it internally, we've turned to other countries. We've outsourced software development. We've outsourced a fair amount of IT work because the capability exists in India, in China, in the Philippines, in Singapore, etc. And as they have done well, and as they've continued to invest in these areas, we are being hollowed out. And that's just a commentary about the situation. So if we're going to stay competitive and if we're going to play in the space that's going to be relevant to us into the future, we have to continue to invest in competency building in these areas. And so, as we've said before, it has to be, it can't be anything but bipartisan. I mean, this is a sort of a virtuous conversation. It's not a zero-sum game. We should be investing in appropriate teaching. The current public debate around the interest and relevance of coding is helpful. We may end up slightly disagreeing on whether it should be part of a core curriculum, but it should be part of the educational process. So that's part of the issue. The other part is the question you're asking about collaboration between government, industry and universities. Yep. And often the mental model, when people say universities and industry don't cooperate enough, the mental model is big companies and universities, so BCA type, the Myers, etc. In reality, the engine room of the Australian economy for growth and for job growth, is the SMEs category. And it's really the SMEs that we've got to try to find a way to marry up with universities, and that requires behavioural changes and maybe even cultural changes on both parts. SMEs don't normally look to universities for help in their product innovation and manufacturing and marketing, and universities and academics tend to have as their primary scorecard published papers that don't go further in terms of patents and commercialisable products. I think the discussion is making progress, but we're at a fairly early stage of that.
Okay, I'm going to leapfrog into the minds of the organisations and around the productivity question with John here. So McKinsey's published a report recently around improving Australia's global competitiveness, and I think you've touched on a little bit of that, Ziggy, with the description around the IT, the offshoring and outsourcing of IT. So what's your take, John, on what organisations need to do to drive productivity within their organisations and within the local market?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sue. And yeah, to go back to that report, I think you're talking about the work we did with the BCA on competitiveness and comparative advantage. And it's worth talking about why we did that, because we were worried about Australia and the future for the country we all live in. And why would we be worried given Australia's had this 23 years of economic growth? Well, if you look at it, and we did look to the last 10 years of that, 90% of our income growth came from the two things, right? The terms of trade and resource investment. Both of them, a year later, a year after we published that, completely gone away, exposing the rest of the economy. And that report said 9 out of 12 sectors are actually uncompetitive. Right, and that's against the United States, let alone places with far lower income levels. So what do we need to do? And I think there's a link to the CEDA work in here. But first of all, there are some sectors where Australia is competitive, and we need to clear away the barriers that are there and invest and help those compete. I'm talking about things like agriculture, where we could do a lot more, talking about education, where there's some amazing work going on, but we could do even more to make that a source of exports and competitiveness. The other side of it, of course, we've done all right, not just because of that mining boom, but because of the 9 uncompetitive sectors, many have been protected. Right? If you think in the old days of even retail, not now, right? Telco, banking, a bit protected. That's all going away now. That's completely going away, so we can't rely on things protected in the age of the internet because everything is tradable. So what I think we need to do is look at the actual tasks behind those sectors, and I think here's a bit of a link to the CEDA work, is our report thought that it's not just about the job you do, it's the task, and there's production tasks, there's interaction tasks, and there's transaction tasks. Now, the production and transaction, we are probably not going to be very competitive in those over time, apart from in niche areas like agriculture, resources, maybe some parts of advanced manufacturing. The transaction tasks, as I think many of you have said, can get done just over the internet anywhere. So it's these interaction jobs. And what I mean there is ones requiring collaboration, problem solving, teamwork, innovation, thinking. They're the ones where Australia can really compete, where we are productive and we are competitive. You see a lot of those in healthcare. You see a lot of those in, some parts of education. What I think we need to do is, in addition to the focus on the stem cells vocational training, which is absolutely right and much needed, is help our educators and help our country grow these interaction skills in our workforce. And big compliment to Ziggy and RMIT. I think there's a course there, an online masters you've just started on strategic and business-oriented thinking for designers, which is tremendous, right? Big kudos to UTS here in Sydney, which has got a course in innovation and creative thinking, which is offered as an elective as part of their STEM courses, massively oversubscribed. So as well as focusing on the sectors where we can compete, removing the barriers, I think if we can grow our interaction skills, those design thinking, innovation, and get that as something where Australia can really win, then we can get around this challenge, create more jobs for the future.
Thank you. And Richard, we've got a slightly different angle we're going to take with you. So we've talked about the collaboration, we've talked about the development of future skills and productivity, but from a consumer perspective, it drives what you need to do to have the workforce and the organisation that you need. What are the things that you can give us insights into in what's driving the change driven by the consumer?
Well, the first thing I would say is that these forces of change that Sue was talking about, globalisation and digitisation, are just as much affecting the consumer as well as they are businesses and people that are in the workforce. And we know that technology drives significant social change. And we know that things like shopping are very social activities, in fact. So we shouldn't be at all surprised that the nature of retail is actually changing and the nature of the consumer is changing. But what I think is the common theme that runs through all of this line of thinking is that the consumer is an individual, and it's the individual that is actually rising here. It's the rise of the individual as the key theme that impacts them as being, whether they're a consumer or whether they're a worker within an organisation. And the line between who is a worker and who is a consumer, if you like, and who is employed by the business and who is actually a consumer of a business's services is blurring in the digital world. And we see this playing out internationally now as Uber, of course, battles through the courts to decide whether their drivers are in fact employees or whether they're in fact consumers of a service that's provided by Uber. And so this theme of the rise of the consumer, a digitally empowered consumer, who is now able to take control of their own lifestyles, their own careers, and manage themselves, if you like, through their career and specialise in areas that particularly they have expertise in and be able to bring unique skills to bear, is a consistent theme. And even in our world, that blend between who is a consumer and who is an employee is something that's changing. In fact, our best shoppers, of course, are the people that we employ within our organisation as well. If you map that out with a generational shift that's happening, and you see the rise of millennials coming through that picture as well, where a third of the workforce now are actually millennials, with the other third being Gen X and baby boomers. What it means is that people with a very different perspective on life, a very different worldview, and therefore the consumers in our business, are pushing us to approach our business in a very different way. And we're seeing that play out through, for example, in our retail businesses. All good businesses respond to the consumer. The consumer is now the rise of the individual who wants to be talked to in a very personal way, which is driving the way we think about our business. And it's giving rise to what we would describe as a new retail model, a retail 2.0, if you like, where it is still inherently customer-centric, but now it's data and digital-driven under the surface, and it's without boundaries. It's now not bounded by the same geographies that it used to be, and it's beyond the channels as well, and the physical channels now are being disrupted, and we're seeing retail being delivered on a model that now is through a multiple of different channels. It's not simple enough to just say it's gone mobile, because mobile is itself an inherently fragmented channel about how that plays out through different devices. So this notion of the rise of the individual is significantly shaping the way we view consumers, and it's shaping the way all retail businesses are having to adapt.
It's such I love this part of the conversation because your consumer is your employee, is your service provider. We're one in the same, and the choice of individual is driving so much about what companies need to do. When you bring that back to its base, it's about, I believe, something around the skills and what the future skills are that people are going to need to have to be able to be the consumer, to be the employee, to be the service provider. So you've done quite a bit of discussion and research in this space when you look at what individuals need to have from a skill perspective and what organisations need to be to understand how to interact with that really diverse worker base or employee base. What does that look like now in the future, do you think?
Well, I mean, to some degree, the skills that are needed are driven by the biggest industries there. So, when I talk about demographic change, clearly that's had a huge impact on the fact that the health and social assistance industry is our biggest industry and has been growing so significantly over the last couple of decades. And services generally, but it's really health and also professional, scientific and technical. So again, as Ziggy was saying, those very human knowledge and technical skills are the ones that have been growing most and is the ones that people need. And in terms of businesses, I think it really is that ability to be connected to educators and educators connected to business to ensure that they are developing skills that are very relevant to what's required by industry and workplaces. Not so specific to be just relevant to one workplace, but certainly those close connections can give real-time information back to educators about how industry is changing. So I'm working with Western Sydney Institute at the moment, and they are very closely involved with Barangaroo, just behind us here, and they've had a real hand-in-glove partnership with those guys in terms of developing the skills as issues come up. And one of the things that they were gearing up for, and it's a small example, but was they got to a point where they were going to be putting windows into the building and were gearing the apprentices up to learn a particular piece of the job around framing. Now, when those windows came from China, they already had frames, so they weren't doing that anymore. Now, that might be relevant to that one organisation, but it may well be relevant to what's starting to happen in industry, and so the educational offering can start to be adapted to what's relevant and needed, both by the student and by industry.
Sue, I just want to tell a story that is one that Professor Linda Grattan tells, and she's one of the lead authors, Martin, in the CEDA report. So she recalls or references the fact that back in the late 90s, 96 I think, IBM developed a supercomputer which it called Deep Blue that was going to take on Garry Kasparov as the then reigning global chess grandmaster in the game of chess. And in the first round in 96, Kasparov won the best of 6 games, but with upgraded software in 97, the computer called then Deeper Blue beat Garry Kasparov, and that was sort of interpreted as the beginning of the modern era of artificial intelligence, and concerns were raised about computers displacing people in many functions. In reality, with the passage subsequently of the next 15 or so years, what has happened is that computers have certainly got smarter, but the combination of a capable, talking at kind of world-class level, chess master with a reasonable modern PC loaded with reasonable chess software can beat a supercomputer. And this has now led, and does beat a supercomputer, this has now led to the view that augmented intelligence, us regular people, augmented by some form of computer assistance in the form of the environment we work in, or the PCs or the iPads that we use, is likely to be the form of work for some time to come, and that time could be considerable time.
So are you referring to augmented reality when you can interact within a real environment and a non-real environment? Do you see that as one of the developing skills, or one of the areas where organisations need to focus of how to be current with their customers, how to be current with their employees, and how to interact?
Well, I think augmented reality technically is probably quite a big step forward. That's simulated environments in a kind of a 3D manifestation. But in terms of what we've already seen in a number of companies, and NBN is one of them, where you can walk into a product development or a software development area, be surrounded by screens with real-time connectivity to all of your other partners around the world, and basically talk to them without any kind of inhibition, because you're kind of working on, usually in a lean or agile mode on certain projects. That is already here, and you can forecast how that's going to unfold, particularly if you're as confident as technologists are about the continuing improvement in computer capability and user friendliness that we can foreshadow, for maybe another 10 or 20 years.
So, John, I'm going to hand that one to you to take, if you could, because if one of the key things that we'd spoken about discussing today was employee engagement, productivity, and driving productivity rather than downsizing and retrenching, upskilling. So, the workforce of 5 years ago would never have dreamed that they'd be sitting across the table on a video conference to the extent the interaction is today. It's only one example, but can you talk to us about that?
I mean, look, the technology is accelerating. As the Minister said, the number of mobile connections to the internet is greater than the population of the planet, right? And 20 years ago, 1% of the planet was connected to the internet and 3% of people had a mobile phone. So in 20 years, that's happened. And I agree with the Minister, this has all happened before in ancient Greece and the Industrial Revolution, but it took a lot longer then, right? It took a lot longer, 500 years between Gutenberg's printing press and the first computer printer. So our workforce has to be ready to this pace of change that is incredibly fast and only going to get faster. So lots about technology, but it's mostly we think about mindset. And part of it is that creative problem solving and thinking. And the other part, and again, what the Minister said, we have to be ready to cannibalize ourselves. We have to be ready to reinvent our business models. Yes, that's true at a company level, absolutely true. But companies they don't make decisions, people make decisions, and people have to work in them. So there's no point trying to carry on doing what you're doing, maybe cutting a few costs every year, getting more productive, if your business model's dead. You've got to see round the corner what's in the future and build something that isn't just competing in Australia, but can be globally scalable, as these models can, right? Uber wasn't invented in Australia, but it could have been. But hey, Mathletics was, right? So we've got a chance here, particularly that we're close to Asia and 2.4 billion emerging middle-class consumers over the next decade and a half, to own a lot of that market if our workforce, all of us in this room, can see the future and be prepared to change. And of course, now I'll tell you a quick story, right, about any of you work for banks here, because I was chatting to someone and just said, hey, you banks, you still charge fees for credit cards, but I'm in a lot of other countries around the world, you don't do that. So how long do you think you've got in Australia? And of course, the people I talked to said, there's no way we can stop charging fees for credit cards because that's how we make our money, right? And that's how I get my bonus at the end of the year, is because I make money. I said, well, you've got to rethink that. There's lots of ways you can monetize credit cards, like all the transactions people do, that's got value. Someone wants to open a flower shop in Balmain, you can look at that and say, hey, people in Balmain buy flowers online, so don't do it, save your money, that's got value. But of course our workforce has to be prepared to forego the bonus on the credit card fees in order to build something that can be globally scalable and create employment and opportunities for Australia in the next decade. That's our challenge, and I think it's a challenge as business and community leaders in this room we're going to have to solve.
I'm going to hand that back to Richard again, because the retail sector here in Australia generates about 5% of our GDP. The globalisation, all the things that we know is driving change within that sector. What are you seeing that you need to really alter and be so agile for when it comes to work practices and how to source people, how to drive career paths differently for people and to reskill them?
Well, digital, of course, is coming to life now in the in-store environment. And, a nice example of this is we've just introduced iPads for our assistants who operate in the store, which allows them to check stock levels on the shop floor. But it also allows, when there isn't something that's in stock, it also allows the assistant to order something and have sent to the customer's home from the shop floor in the in-store environment. And that's all part of the sort of department store, high-touch, service-based model that we have. But what it does mean is that some people who've been working in our stores for 40 and maybe 50 years are also learning the new skills of being able to operate with that level of technology in our business. And one of the challenges with all of this, therefore, is that the success of the experience and customer experience, if you like, is something that is turbocharged by digital. Mobile devices and online is a great way of adding a new layer of service into the department store model, but it requires people actually to have those inherent skills. Now, one of the nice things that's happened over the course of mobile devices, principally driven by Apple, is that they're now easy interfaces to use, whereas pre the Apple iPhone, it was very much you had to be a technical person to be able to use a technical device. What's democratized technology is the ability for people to now use technical devices, digital devices, but in an analog way. To turn the page on an iPad, you turn the page like you turn the page in a book. You don't turn the page by pressing keys that you have to be technically trained in. And this has made it possible for us now to make technology ubiquitous and universally available across the kind of service model that we have. And it also means that when it then comes to training people for the long-term future, given that we're now in a position where it is so easy to use, what education has to respond to and the training has to respond to is we're training people up for jobs that don't actually exist yet in the workforce. And the people that went through our early training, and even the majority of people in this room, are possibly now doing jobs for which they could not possibly have had training for when they went through education, because the jobs that they're doing now, particularly if you're in digital and you're in disrupted industries, could not have existed. So the essential elements that we have to build into our training and the way we think about education are actually our ability to be able to take those elements of STEM, for example, that Ziggy was talking about, but overlay the skills then of change and innovation and bringing stuff to marketing and commercializing stuff as much as it is having the raw skills under the surface. And this is what's playing out in retail.
So I'm going to throw a question to whoever wants to answer this one on the panel. We all know that productivity and participation in Australian workforce is what's going to drive some economic, combat some of the economic challenges and productivity challenges that we have. We've got, for the first time ever, 5 generations in a workforce that all have very, very different skills, and you've just tapped into that just briefly now. Even those in this room here, what do we need to do as leaders in organisations and leaders in institutions to ensure that we touch all demographics, the different needs that they have and the different skills requirements that they have to build upon or build towards? Who wants to take that as a big question?
Can I help set the question up further?
Yeah, if you can.
Not try to answer it, because we were talking about this offline. Firstly, the concept of the careers and work life is now being redefined quite quickly. So where 20 years ago, Sue, a person might have studied, taken on a full-time job, thought about a career, developed over maybe 2 or 3 assignments in different employers, and then ended with paid work in their 60s. Mm-hmm. Today, certainly university students are all working part-time. They may or may not get a full-time job initially. I think you're saying that during a working life of 40 or 45 years, they'll have probably 15 different jobs. Yep. And the concept of retirement is now, I think, a bit dated, because A, we're living older and for longer, and we need to be able to finance over a longer period of time. And so the kind of edges of the distribution are being stretched right out. And it's one thing to describe the situation that way. It's another thing to try to divine, and what does this mean to us? And I know in the technology space, you're naive if you look too far ahead. You just cannot pick it. So we've got to get some fundamentals right. We've got to, obviously investing in education is a good thing. Investing in, or being prepared to be very, very flexible in adjusting to different work environments, and this is now being reinforced through multiple assignments with different employers. Definitions of success may be different to simply moving up a hierarchy in a large organisation. I note in our report, Stephen, that more than 30% of current jobs are part-time or casual. Another nearly 10% are self-employed and entrepreneurs. If you do something that's mathematically unwise, which is to extrapolate 50 years, that the sum of that gets to between 50 and 60%. Well, if you're dealing with a national workforce which is substantially casual, substantially self-employed, and a small proportion, a minority proportion is employed by big companies on a full-time basis. That is so different to where we've come from. So that's the issue. So I haven't attempted to answer the question.
No, but you've led me to a question for John. So what would how would they advise organisations to tackle that?
Yeah, and it's a big issue, right? And it's getting to be a bigger issue. Whereas we do need to be agile and flexible. It's not just about Australia. If you're born in Australia doesn't mean you're going to be working in Australia. You know, anyone can just get out their phone now, go on to Mechanical Turk or Airtasker or something like that. And hey, if you want to make back the price of your lunch ticket, you can probably do some of these things on Mechanical Turk. They'll pay you, 8 cents, I think it was, for looking up phone numbers for other people if they give you a name and a company somewhere in the world. You can do that, right? So, you know what doesn't have to be done in Australia? And I don't think you'd make back the price of your lunch ticket from doing those, even if you were very good. So we do have to be agile. We do have to be flexible. And it's not the job for life. It's many different ways we can perform tasks. But I do think there's a role. So McKinsey's here. I would advise all business people that we have an obligation to work with the public sector, the social sector, to help Australia overcome the challenge and create this as an opportunity. And I'd say particularly for the young, because while there are 5 generations in the workforce, what concerns me and what concerns me as an Australian is that I think it was in the report 14% of 15 to 24-year-olds don't have a job, right? And I think it's about high 20% in some parts of Australia. That really, really makes me concerned, because the natural reaction where jobs are reducing is to go for the experienced people, and the young don't get an opportunity, and that is not the prosperous, socially inclusive country that we want to live in. Won't fix itself. Business leaders, I'm really urging us all here to think what we can do, partnering with the public sector, the social sector, to create opportunities, to give the internships, apprenticeships, flexible opportunities for people to gain skills and participate in the workplace. So the Minister's right. When we were at the sleep out last night, it's very easy to see the spiral that you get onto if no job, right, no housing, and that's a tragedy. And I don't want that tragedy happening to anyone in Australia. We deserve better. So I think it's not able to be solved just by business, certainly not by company. We're going to have to all get together and do this.
I was just going to say that in America, 44% of the on-demand worker pool is millennial. And one of the challenges that traditional business has is that we tend to think of people, we look for employees and people to join our organisation, and we think about it in terms of a long-term prospect. But interestingly, just perhaps a large part of the future model is actually on businesses to have working models in the way they go about doing the business, which actually embrace people whose actually ambition in life is to move from company to company and bring very specific skills to company after company, which is something many of us, as in the traditional business sense, you tend to look for people as long-term investments within your organisation. And yet I think there's probably a growing pool of people who that isn't actually what they're looking for from business and from a career and from employment. And maybe there's a different lens for employers there as well.
Yeah, and that's, you see that with the crowdsourcing sites. I was quite surprised to see the growth that's occurred in crowdsourcing, and you might expect that the people that are putting themselves forward to do that work are, highly technical computer people from subcontinent, but in actual fact, the growth of employees there have been very much highly educated North Americans. So that you do have the younger people looking to have a different employment experience. Our senior managers are not digital natives, and yet they are the people in organisations making those decisions. And there's quite a bit of room too, I think, for a bit of reverse mentoring, so that those that are new into the organisation have the benefits of spending time with the senior managers, having more of that strategic view, but also being able to share some of those skills. And of course, senior managers used to be the people that held the expertise and made the decisions, but that's changing so much more now. They need to know where to find the expertise, network with people, and understand that good ideas can come from anywhere within their organisation, more likely outside of the organisation.
Did you have a comment, Ziggy? No. I'm going to open up to the floor for some questions. We've got 5 or 10 minutes or so. We've got a hand straight up the front here, please, the lady in the front table. If you could state your name and where you're from and just a brief question, that would be great, thank you. And if you're asking a direct question to one of the panel, please.
Rachel David, Johnson & Johnson, also working in a STEM environment in the Macquarie Technology Park. On this issue of the workforce, a huge demographic change that has occurred over the last 100 years is that the human race in developed countries has gained an extra 40 years of life on average. And coming from the healthcare sector, a lot of that life is now quite productive. People are not crippled on the couch anymore. People can live with up to 5 chronic conditions in reasonable health if their conditions are appropriately treated. So Ziggy has talked about retirement being dead as a concept. How is work over the age of 60 going to change as a result of technological change? Because that will be the expectation of people now. We can confidently expect that people will have a job in up to their maybe even 80 in the next few years.
Yeah. Can I take that? Thank you. It's a very, very appropriate question. Firstly, the economy is shifting quite quickly to being a service economy. So it's no longer based upon physically demanding manual work, and which might then limit the working lifetime, particularly of males that are involved, but of people in general. So as the nature of work shifts into a service environment and is characterised by people in healthcare, in the public service, in hospitality and tourism, it's probably not going to be as physically onerous for older people. The other thing is, I was reading the other day, at the moment the record for the oldest person in the world who recently died is 116. You can actually extrapolate that over the decades, and so we're going to live longer. I don't think anybody is quite going to get to 150 in the time people think, but we're going to get closer to that in the decades ahead. And so what we've got is a life expectancy which for women is moving through 85, 86 years through to 90 to 95. Some living to be 120 and 130, but people, as you've indicated, in that kind of 60, 70, 80, 90 period, being well, having to work in order to support themselves financially, because I suspect the limits on government budgets are going to constrain the ability for governments to do anything other than to provide social safety nets for the most needy. But I think the nature of work, the assisted and augmented intelligence that will come with technology, and the fact that we're not going to be physically making stuff that's hard yards, but working in a service environment will provide us with the answer. So I'm kind of optimistic that we're going to find ways to do that, in part because we have no choice.
Yeah, I'd just add exactly, Ziggy, and I think these interaction jobs we're talking about are really suited to people with life experience that have been around the block that can help. And that experience in many of the sectors where Australia is productive is something that's going to be very tradable with the rest of the world. So using digital technology, having someone who might be in their 60s and 70s but knows their way around mine planning over a screen to somebody in Africa who's trying to do some mine planning, that's a great export for Australia. So it's not only these workforce can be productive, they can be great at helping Australia compete and win globally too.
Might take another question from the floor.
Hi, Parnell McGuinness from Thought Broker. Look, I would be very interested to hear from you, especially Ziggy, I suppose. You were saying before that you didn't expect the jobs of the future to look like the ones of the past. Can you hear me? Is that clear? Yeah, okay. And yet the government is proposing to bring in coding in schools. This seems like we'll be going to, it'd be like teaching children 20 years ago how to program with punch cards. Do you have any comments on that, whether that's a wise move?
Yeah. So thank you for that. Is that to me?
Yeah, for you.
Okay. So coding. I mean, coding, it's a very good issue to put on the table to generate some discussion and debate around. And there's no question that if we believe that the future is all about augmented intelligence supported by computers, devices, embedded chips, etc., that it feels like coding is a skill we should be aware of, and it is. probably introduced at elementary school level and then developed through high school. As to whether there are careers in coding or careers in software development, you'd have to hesitate. There are 11 million coders around the world at the moment, mainly in India, in China. There's a reason why we are outsourcing software development, because these nations and their graduates are very, very good, and we are way behind, and we are also subcritical in terms of numbers. But if you look at the way young children are being taught, not coding so much, but logical analysis, the gamification of certain topics where kids can use highly specialised languages to move things around, to achieve a certain outcome with a particular icon, it's very impressive. That's exactly the right thing to do. But as you say, don't try to pick the right code that you have to teach people in. There isn't such a thing. There are hundreds of codes. There are some that go back 50 years that still have some relevance. And then there are emerging codes coming out all of the time. So the logic of it all, the joy of being able to understand how things work in the toys that you play with or the screens that you work with is being developed anyway. I think we just as a society have to respect that, encourage that, upskill teachers who are inherently, not in every case, but in many cases a bit insecure about these technologies. And then I think we as a nation will develop the sort of skills that we need to develop. And Sue, just by way of a personal anecdote, I mean, people in this audience, many will have very young children. I have three young granddaughters under the age of 4, and it's unsettling to see them walk up to every screen and try to swipe it and try to move things around. Firstly, they have the aptitude. Secondly, they're in an environment in their schools where this is being developed without us redefining the curriculum.
My son presented his PowerPoint presentation to the class yesterday on transport in New South Wales, and it had a video embedded in it that he made with an app.
Yeah.
He's 8.
Yep.
I mean, he's 8 years old. He's no Einstein, but that's the reality.
So we've got 8-year-olds designing transport in Sydney. Now I understand.
I didn't say it was any good. I just said he did it. I think we've got time for one more question from the floor, if there is one. Someone down here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sandy Plunkett. I have a slightly provocative question, and I'm really hoping the panellists will take it in the right vein. It's really about this issue of collaboration between what I would call all ecosystem participants in a world of digital disruption and innovation. Just about any report, many of them global international reports that have done before the CEDA report today, talks about one of the key attributes of any diversified and healthy economy moving forward in a tech age is a really vibrant, strong entrepreneurial startup sector. Not just a small business sector, but a tech-driven, IP-driven startup sector. So the collaboration has to include engagement with not just SMEs, but startups. But yet, here we have a panel today discussing all these issues and no representation from the SMEs or the startup sector. Now, this is a reflex that I see time and time again in Australia Fora. I'm just wondering, what do you think the block is there between allowing and getting these voices on panels like this? And what can any of you tell us about what you've been doing lately to better engage with those classes?
I'm going to take the lead on that one and say that I don't think the lack of representation at the table here is deliberate. We've got a rich and diverse panel that touch all facets of sector and industry and all different levels. But the question is collaboration completely. Can anyone give us an example of where?
Well, not quite in the startup space, but in a modern corporation. I would say that there is also the need for the horizontal engagement through the traditional silos of an organisation, which encourages exactly that collaboration point that you're raising, Sandy. And what organisations need to adopt is a much greater willingness to have a much more sort of de-layered and more empowered structure that allows collaboration to happen much more naturally than has happened in historical, more hierarchical organisations. And I do think that can be deliberately brought about. And a lot of companies now talk about, the need for huddles and cross-team thinking. And of course, digital is one of the great tools to enable that to happen, with Google Hangouts and so on and so forth. So the tools, I think, are there to encourage innovation, and a lot of corporations are now taking that on. I see it happening in a corporate space. What I can't comment on is the startup world, which obviously where Sandy's question went.
Can I just add quickly, Sue, that, and remind the audience that I represent one of the world's most ambitious and largest startups, NBN.
That's right. That's right. And I know you've got the new Enterprise Investment Fund and things here at RMIT too. I mean, look, this is a huge issue. Let's not, and it is inside companies, by the way. We're lucky we're a partnership, so we don't have the fear of failure, market expectations. It's surprising to know 2/3 of the work we're doing with our clients today, we didn't even have 5 years ago, right? And in a 90-year-old company like McKinsey, surprise you. We also notice it's an issue for Australia. There's multiple billions of research going on. We've got this massive super fund, but as Larry Marshall, new head of CSIRO, will tell you, there's a valley of death where the venture money, early stage venture money, is something like $2 for every one of us, really. And that's compared to hundreds of dollars in the US or Israel. But we've all got super accounts. So one thing we can do is get them to play a role in the ecosystem. And I think as business, McKinsey, every 3 years we have a big shared cause. It was diabetes prevention and care, closing the gap in digital education. But for the next 3 years, we're doing entrepreneurship, because we realise we can't, just solve this. We need to convene a group of people, leaders, not just business but political and societal too. And we need to close that gap in entrepreneurship, because that growth, that competitiveness is going to come not just from our existing companies, but from startups that can disrupt Australia and the world for our benefit.
Well, it looks like we could have a much longer conversation this afternoon, but unfortunately we're short on time. A couple of salient points that I think we all need to take home from today's session is, what is it that you're going to think, do and be differently out of today? It is a 258-page report. I suggest you read all 258 pages. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Tony Warren to propose a vote of thanks to our panel, who is a Group CEO of Corporate Affairs for Telstra. Thank you.